So last week, or perhaps a week and a half ago, I had begun a series of re-examinations of a piece that I had completed in the late 1980s called Displacements. And I had explained the rationale for returning to that piece. And I had explained what I had originally intended and why I thought it was relevant today. And just to restate a couple of issues in that direction, the piece had to do with trajectories of experience and the sharing of experience from a kind of point of view of being an audience to another's attention and ability to experience the world. And I thought this was relevant today because we have a crisis. I don't think it's even an arguable statement of a crisis of social engagement in a time of great turbulence, great social unrest, and the potentiality of change. And if we choose to be attendants in this time that aren't engaged in a kind of participatory way with the various aspects of our social identities and social becomings, we risk the very great danger of allowing those who would continue to maintain power over us to succeed in doing so. And the time to act is now. Without describing too much in terms of the history of performativity and performance arts, I think one can very much be reminded of the kind of real theater and living theater pieces of Julian Beck and others in the 60s and early 70s, in which this sort of utopian ideal of human engagement in the artistic process was seen, in light of this revolutionary potential. And without getting into that history too much, I think that this is part of the incentive for reviving and revising even these issues today. Now, I had been I have been paused in that process because I have been paused in the process of re-examining this work because here on the Navajo Nation, it's the anniversary of an extremely traumatic event in which it's the 5th year anniversary in which a child was murdered here. In a very violent manner. So we're all dealing with that experience and trying to process why that happened, and how we can remember it in such a way that our remembering it changes the possibility of its happening. That is, that we won't allow it to happen again. And this is a very difficult thing, and so having to process that again, put a pause on my looking at these pieces, but, things are connected. And so maybe I can find a way of drawing these pieces in that direction, or drawing that event and our need to respond to it, into my reexamination of this early work of mine. I had described a particular event and a particular encounter with an individual who had a number of what we sometimes refer to as disabilities, which word I think is problematic and somewhat disturbing in and of itself. But he had limitations in his physical abilities in relationship to seeing. He was blind, and mobility. He was in a wheelchair. And there seemed to be a kind of different way of processing information that he had. And I don't like to put labels on individuals, and I'm not a labelist, and I'm not a believer in sorting in that sort of way. And I find that it is as problematic as labeling something good or bad. That generally that the label itself has more of a political and social sorting function than it has any useful value. So he had a unique way of processing information and seeing the world, even beyond the limitations of what he was experiencing. So even beyond, blindness and the mobility issues, there was sort of an interesting way of organizing the world. And I had talked about that event, and then what I hadn't talked about was the way that I represented that event in the piece. And that's what I want to talk about today. So last week I had noted that I had lost, in the process of the many, many years that I had produced this installation work, I had lost images from it. And I hadn't fully discussed the images themselves, but one of the performers in the piece was an individual who played the part of a documentary photographer, and his role was to walk around and take pictures of the event. So he had a participatory role that didn't involve verbal interaction with the attendants, the unscripted attendants, but that involved capturing their images and documenting in various ways interactions with the work, whether those interactions were remote or close, or verbal or nonverbal. And for a long time I had these works, and some of them I had framed later in larger images, those documents could have become an installation art piece in and of themselves, but obviously now they never will, because they're lost. But in any case, I had discussed the loss of these images over time, and the need now to find suitable replacements for them if I were to address the work. Now, the image that you're looking at is a drawing poem from Robert Grenier, and I'm filming it from a YouTube page that involves a discussion between Charles Bernstein and Al Filreis regarding the reading and interpretation of this particular poem drawing. Now, there are a number of reasons why I chose this image that I may or may not, discuss in my remembering of the piece that I want to talk about. But I think some of it will probably come out. So let me go to that memory. So I had talked about meeting this young man in a park in San Diego, Balboa Park, and he was wheelchair bound and blind, but he was an attendant at a playtime for children that were clearly on a field trip from somewhere. And they were playing in a tree, and they were laughing, and they were playing together. And because of his limitations, he couldn't play in the same way. And he was, by virtue of the fact of his physicality and who he was, I had called that being before, but being, that word has so much baggage that I don't really want to participate with. It has all this German existentialist baggage, which really doesn't belong here in any way, shape, or form. And what I really meant by being was the embodied consciousness, because in almost a kind of Merleau-Pontian way, this individual clearly experienced the world in ways that were unique to his physical and mental nature. And I had mentioned before that observing him was a revelation for me, because I realized that in some way that we all do this, and to varying or degrees, greater or lesser, that are unique ways of being in the world, really define us as unique experiencing subjects. There is no universal subject, because there is no completely round way of seeing the world, right? That's the circle is always in some way, shape, or form unique, and so it's not just one of another circles. It's a particular shape. Just like the lines that represent letters here are unique and not universalized in any way. Now, I want to describe the way that I translated that particular. No, I used the word translated, and I didn't want to use that word yet, but it had been suggested to me that I perceived these events that I wanted to place in the piece. It had been presented that one of the ways that one could imagine the movement from the experience of the world into the work of art was as a translation. So how would you translate the encounter with this young man into work? And I added the idea in translation, you could say so you have this word, say it's door, and you want to translate it into another language. You look for an equivalent word in that language that leads you as quickly and directly to that word as you can get. So the word that I had come up with for this idea of the direct movement from this word to that, say from the word door to port, or thyrsis, or any other word for door, was displacement. So this is a term from physics, and it's the direct route, right? So in translation, the direct route from door into the English word into French could be porte, or you could take an indirect route. I wanted the idea of displacement to be challenged, right? So what would an indirect route be? Well, an indirect route could be travail, how is a door in some way like work, right? Well, that's very indirect, maybe too indirect. Can you get there? That's certainly a long path around the displacement. So I wanted these routes, just like in this image, you have these long routes to L. Filreis and Charles Bernstein described this first word written in red as frogs with a long S on the end. Well, it's certainly a long route to the word frogs, isn't it? I mean, there are a lot quicker ways to get there. Now, in my instance, my case, my physical embodiment as someone that has a unique way of inscribing letters, that's sometimes referred to medically as dysgraphia, or it's a term, it's one of those labels, right, that sort people. But anyway, that word might define my relationship to this type of drawing, which is less an act of choice than of embodiment. So I very much, I don't know that I would have drawn the word this way, but I very much experience myself in the way that these letters are formed, right? So my displacement looks different from someone else's. So I really don't know that much about Robert Grenier, and I don't know if he's a dysgraphic. Now, for him, this is a ramble, not a displacement, I imagine, but I could very well be wrong. But you can see that it's the long route in the inscription of the word frogs, right? For whatever reason, whether that's a matter of voluntary choice or an involuntary fact of one's physical characteristics in the world. And so I wanted my translations, including my translation of the experience of this child, listening, to his fellows play in the tree, to be a kind of long, rambling route rather than direct. And I had used that notion of displacements in order to convey that idea. So what I wanted to do today, and what I began with, was a promise that I would describe some of these ways of representing experiences. And I've discussed that experience, I think, enough that you know what the context is that I want to talk about in terms of translating or displacing or rambling into an aesthetic representation. And what I had done for this piece in the process of displacing or translating or non-displacing and rambling was I knew that I needed some representation of the tree. And I knew that I didn't want it to be a tree. I wanted to give some kind of, problematic to the tree, because the tree of life that all the children played in was somehow denied this young man who I called in the piece Denny, which was not his name, but I'll call him Denny now. There were a number of reasons for choosing this word, Denny, his name. But and I thought of Plato and the cave, and then I thought of den, and the way that a den is a safe place for a child, or for someone that needs shelter, right? That translates cave in a way into something beyond what Plato had in mind. So Denny, Denny was in some way denied access to this tree of life, or this springtime image, this exfoliating, branching toward the sky from the earth, this connecting thing. And I wanted, in the choosing, in the selecting of the translation, I wanted something that captured that. And I thought of, I thought of a large cactus. And, so the first thing that I did was I went to the local nursery, and I looked at, cactuses and little pots, and they were extremely expensive, and I thought, this isn't quite what I had in mind. It gives, the thorns on the cactus give this idea of like a defense system that intrudes upon one's ability to participate in the tree, but it's not enough. I need something still more. So I thought, maybe an artificial cactus would work. And then I went to a furniture store. This was Southern California in the 80s, and there was at this time, and there may still be, there was a kind of like fetishization of Southwest style, the Navajo rugs that get stolen from the Navajo people and put on people's walls, and without the people that make them really making any profit, and the aestheticization of these kind of like artificial mission style chairs and things like that. So it was pretty easy to find a store that would include like a fake plastic cactus, and I found one, but these two were really, really extremely expensive. But fortunately, the store owner let me borrow the cactus for the piece. Now, this was like pretty impressive experience. How often do you go into a store and explain like that you need this particular object for a purpose that it wasn't intended for, and they say, well, just borrow it from me and return it, in good shape, and it doesn't happen. So I was really impressed, and I thought, this is a way of participating in the work, right? Sharing. This is a way of moving beyond merely being a passive attendant in the work. I explained to him what I wanted to do, and he gave me something that was his, and he wanted me to return it, of course, but he lent me this important object, valuable object, because it was obviously too expensive for me to buy, so it must have been expensive, and that was something, so that I never really had the opportunity to fully explain that, but that was also perceived from my point of view as a kind of participation in the work, not a mere, all readings and all participations and all interpretations, are active meaning producing events. But sometimes the activity gets hidden. We come up with metaphors for a poem as an object or a thing, and we forget like the basic principles of observation, which are that the observing changes what you are observing. And this is always going on in profound ways, not in insignificant ways. And these are the kinds of profound ways and experiences that I wanted to capture in the piece. So I'm pleased that I have the opportunity to describe, because I never took a picture of this gentleman who lent me the cactus. I have opportunity to describe the way that this individual participated in the reading and understanding and creation of this work. So I had gotten this cactus, and that was the first object, and then I knew I needed to translate the wheelchair somehow, and I thought, the wheelchair, it's somehow it's both a means, for him to experience the world in ways that he wouldn't be able to experience without it, but it's also limiting, in a certain sense. It doesn't allow him to experience the world in the same way that someone would who doesn't require, assistance with mobility. And so I thought, in some way, it's like a provision that one would make for a child, and then the translation the displacement became pretty easy. I found a stroller, and I think I borrowed the stroller from someone who had a newborn, or maybe it was an old stroller from a parent who didn't require it at this time. I can't exactly remember, but I do remember that it was another borrowed object. Now, I don't want to talk too much about economy in revisiting this piece, because I really do want to focus on this idea of participation in occurrences and events that we experience in our daily lives. But just in passing, it wasn't entirely accidental that a lot of the materials that I used for this piece were borrowed, because I wanted, this is an entirely different facet of this piece that I really didn't want to engage too much. But I really wanted it to be a meditation on economics as well, and how art is part of certain types of institutions that are primarily economic, and those involve institutions such as museums, galleries, exchanges of art, who owns what, what property is, what property means, what property has to do with the experience of distance, what's the justification when you go into the museum that you can't touch the art? Because it doesn't belong to you. So property is involved in our experience of the world in myriad ways that we aren't always aware of, right? That's mine, take your hands off of it, you're too close, things like this. Car alarms, involve like this idea of proximity and property. So this work explored that in multiple ways as well, but I really don't want to talk about that. It becomes too digressive. So this was another borrowed thing that became part of the representation, the stroller that represented the wheelchair, and then there was representing. The cactus was fine in representing the experience of the distance from the tree, but I also wanted to represent a kind of relationship that was more positive in relationship to the experience of transforming one set of perceptions into another, one set of values into another, one set of, then we talked about translation or displacement, but what in this process of my describing to Denny the events that were going on and answering his questions, how did I translate that into something physical? And I think I found did purchase, but I found a plastic frog, and frogs, for me, had always been images of transformation as a young man, I remember watching, young man, I mean boy. As a child, as a boy, I remember, watching pollywogs, transform into frogs. This is an amazing process that, one had to, observe over the course of, days or weeks. And so this image of this life-giving frog, and frogs obviously have a long history in poetry as well, from Basho, through other things, including this image, right, has the word frogs in it. But one thinks of that splash, in of the frog leaping into the pond, and that the satori, that and I thought of that's what I really had with my encounter with Denny, was that splash of revelation, that wow, this is all of us. This is what we are. This is real. So for a number of reasons, I thought that image, the frog, would call attention to what I wanted people to see. Hear this. Can you hear the frog jumping into the pond? Do you see the frog? The frog will take you where you want to go. So I used the frog as, both an image, a symbol of transformation, and what I had thought my encounter with Denny was like both, him getting information from me, me being able to describe for him what he couldn't see in the scene of the other kids playing, and of the revelations that Denny offered to me as as a symbol of the way that we are embodied in the world. So I thought of it, this way, as a symbol, and I thought of it also as, something that could point. And what it pointed to was, actually, I set it on top of a little cardboard box that whose back surface was a piece of paper. So a kind of translucent veil that one could read text on, right? There was in the front of the box, there was a little a hole, and or maybe two, I can't remember, but you could look into it, but you had to put your face into the box. So you had to get over your fear of picking up this box, and not everyone would pick it up. There wasn't a big arrow saying you can pick up this box. It was just the frog, and then you could see that there was a hole. So you had to be curious, and but like Denny, there wasn't a big sign on Denny that said, "Come talk to me, tell me what's going on. I'm blind." There wasn't, to engage Denny, you had to be interested. You had to care. And not everybody did, right? I mean, he was sitting there outside of the circle, and you really had to engage him. So I wanted the invitation to be there, but I didn't want it to be too obvious. I didn't want it to be a command. I wanted people to find it. I didn't want, like in this poem, I didn't want there to be a translation of it at the bottom. I wanted people to work. Really work as, we should in the world, to help other people that, we experience. So the frog was the symbol that I used as an indicator, a pointer, look in the box if you want to. And the box is what I used as a kind of makeshift, viewfinder, that if you put your face in, you could read the text that I had written or typed out and placed on the panel of the box, which if you held up to the light of the sun, or whatever, you could read. And so on that paper, And I don't remember how many paragraphs I wrote, but there were paragraphs describing the event, and there were translations or displacements that I had made in describing the event as well, including, calling this young man Denny and describing the narration of my experience with him, in ways that weren't exactly a one-to-one correspondence with what I remember, right? And then I had also, in writing this out, I had done further displacements and changed the story in some ways to reflect the other events that I was narrating in this piece, which included, as I had discussed before, which included the whole ongoing politics of the American, farm labor movement and this boycott on grapes and table grapes and raisins that was current in California, to an event in which I had suffered an assault, a traumatic assault, and so I wanted to tie all of these different events together in a number of different ways, and to make these displaced translations relate to one another in an unexpected manner, and that was part of the way that I handled that particular text in this box as well. So coming back to the image that I chose to represent a picture of that particular station, what I like about this picture in representing that is, first of all, the word frog, which is red. Now that's interesting in and of itself, because intuitively you would choose green, right? It's not that there aren't red frogs, but it's not usually what we associate with frog. We usually associate green. Kermit is green, for example, and has his song, "It Isn't Easy Being Green." So making the frog red is, in my mind, not the obvious displacement, but the ramble, just like the graphic design of the letters is a ramble. I also chose it because, obviously, because it reminds me of my own particular embodiment as a dysgraphic, right? Which relates to this whole notion of embodied subjectivity that the piece is about. And so, even though and like I say, I don't really know much about this particular poet, but even though for Robert Grenier, this may not be an embodied way of writing. This may be, completely aesthetic. For me, it obviously resonates with that. And then so it creates this sort of map. The ramble is a map, or a route, and I really liked that in selecting this as a translation of the piece. And then I also liked the fact that it comes from, right, a discussion. And so in some ways what Al Filreis and Charles Bernstein are doing in relationship to this piece, I'm doing in relationship to the work of Displacements, and particularly the Denny station of Displacements. So I like that there's this kind of hidden or invisible analogy, because in the image that you see here, you do not see Charles Bernstein and alphelries. You can see them on the video, but you don't see them. And you don't see me very obviously. Maybe I can find myself. There I am. There I am. So you don't see me very obviously in the narration of this piece, but now you do. But I liked the fact that in moving back and forth between the narrating and the narrated, there was a play of visibility and invisibility. And I think that that comes across even within the image itself, because it is the work of someone's hand, right? So say I had typed out the word frog. Well, you wouldn't see the writer's hand. And so the implied narrator is invisible. You know, there's always an implied narrator, even if you type it. There's like, who was the typist? Was it James Joyce or was it his secretary? You know, Joyce has also an interesting relationship to being an embodied subject that we won't get into here. But I think that the peculiar or the interesting or the unique formation of the words gives you the implications of narration in a certain way. In this case, narrating the act of transcribing the words itself, you know, and calling attention to the need to interpret that act in a way that a text wouldn't. And certainly that is, you know, one of the reasons for selecting this image. And, you know, beyond that, the frame beyond that, you know, selecting this image from a place, right, where an additional narrating and interpreting occurred. And there they are. Like, here's the obvious translation of Charles Bernstein and alphelries right here. You can see how I'm translating that into an image, right? And that's, you know, finally why I selected this image, you know, and not some other one to use as a substitution for what I once had a number of photographs of.